first proposal that I'd like to put forward for the ground portion of these Squadron vehicles is one which I've generally wanted in the game for a long time. The reason for this is because I think it fits the role as a pretty interesting event vehicle, if I'm quite honest, because I don't think it would be overpowered, but it could bring something really interesting into the game because of its general design. The vehicle that I'm talking about is the Soviet KV-7. Now, the Soviet KV-7 is a casemate. It was designed because of certain requirements, which we'll go through, but the main defining factor of the KV-7, or at least the one that I would personally like to see in the game, is the fact that it has 3 guns on it. It has access to a 76mm and also access to 2 45mm alongside of it. The 76mm is the F-34 gun, which you find on many Soviet tanks in the game, and it just seems like a really interesting machine to me because of this overall firepower of it. So let's go through the history of it, and also, where did it come from, and also why didn't it make it to the front, because obviously this thing wasn't mass produced, it was only ever really made in prototype form, so why was that? So the first thing you have to understand is in 1941, the Soviet Union, amidst of Operation Barbarossa, with the Germans pushing into the Soviet Union, and the Soviets pretty much being on the back foot at the point, were looking for solutions to problems that they ran into during Operation Barbarossa. One of the problems which came back from the front was the fact that the weapons that a lot of the tanks had were pretty good with dealing with armor, but they weren't very good at dealing with unarmored targets. So whether it be, stuff like machine gun positions, whether it be stuff such as infantry or general, infantry support, one of the problems is that it just wasn't happening. The guns on certain machines from the tanks were decent against their counterparts, but were just not good enough at dealing with infantry. And since a lot of the fighting was around infantry, they needed to find a solution to this. So there was a directive or an order which actually came down from Big Boy Stalin himself, and it was looking to try and solve this problem. So the Kirov factory was to develop a KV tank which would have 1 F-34 and 2 45mm guns, and the barrels would have no recoil mechanisms. The mechanisms itself would actually be for the triplex, which was taken from the ZIS-5, and there would be no 360-degree traverse, and the traverse would be plus or minus 7.5 degrees or plus or minus 15 degrees, and depending on how the ammunition racks are placed, the ammunition capacity would be 300 rounds, so 100 rounds per gun. In addition to, on top of this, 3 or 4 machine guns would also be placed. And the idea was, by December of that year, they wanted 1 out of 5 KV tanks to be equipped with this triplex idea. So they wanted 1 out of 5 KVs to have this 3-gun setup, which is kind of ambitious, let's just say, but overall it just shows the faith that, the general idea had first. And this was before any prototypes were made, this was before, even designs were made, but Big Boy Stalin was behind this idea 100%. So the general idea, when it came to it, it was named the KV-7, and what it wanted to do is it wanted to create a system, as we said, to deal with stuff like unarmored targets or light field modifications. The idea would be to fire each gun individually or 3 in a volley, which would have been very interesting to see. And the KV-7 was not the only project which actually looked at this idea. The first one, which was designed by factory number 183, was looking at the T-34-3. This was a T-34 which had a turret which also housed 2 45mm guns on top of the F-34, which you normally see mounted on the T-34. The crew would be increased to 5, and the commander was freed from gunner duties, so therefore, basically the gunner still had to deal with 3 guns, so he would have a lot to do, but at least the commander could actually command the tank. And after this as well, the fact is the T-34-3 technical project and design documentation were completed, but there was never a prototype built of it. It was just kind of left in the doldrums. The KV is different though. The KV-7 pushed forward by a few of the higher-ups. The idea of it was, as we said, to try and create a machine which would be able to house these 3 guns in some form of casemate. Now, you've got to remember that they didn't want 360 degrees of traverse on it, so therefore they didn't want a turret, they just wanted some form of casemate. They never actually talked about it as a casemate. Instead, they referred to it as an immobile turret, which is kind of funny, but it's just one of those little, quirks when it comes to it. The other thing as well is the casemate itself had a prismatic shape to it, and this would improve crew conditions, and the lower part of it would spread out to cover the fenders, giving it some increased protection. Many parts from the KV-1 were used in the design process. It was the idea was to make a machine that would be not replicated by the generic KV production that they had, but because of the fact that they were moving a lot of their production east at this point, and because they wanted to try and keep, the engineers building exactly what they were building before, they tried to use as much from the KV-1 side of things as possible to push forward this idea, so they wouldn't have to create too many new parts and therefore make the whole design and the whole thing all over the place. So the KV-7 itself is actually never referred to as an SPG, even though it is pretty much an SPG, and it also became the first SPG which was developed in the Urals that reached the prototype stage. And the factory documentation, the repair tank number 5161, was built in September of 1941, and that was used for the prototype. It received a new casemate, armament, and also some suspension elements were changed because obviously the increased weight of the big old block on the front. So the fact is, as I said, they wanted 1 in 5 tanks to have this setup, and therefore there was a pilot batch in December 1941 put out for 20 hulls, but they wanted to actually be able to test this thing first, and also on top of it, it isn't really known if these pilot batches were actually fully assembled after the prototype, but one thing we do know is there was never any more, KV-7s produced after the single prototypes that we had. So on December the 27th, 1941, the KV-7 completed its trials, but it had a bunch of problems. Since this was hurried out because Stalin had pretty much set a date for it, and obviously you don't want to go against the superiors, there were some real issues. There was no sight which was actually ready to aim all of the guns. So this thing didn't have a sight when it came to actually optically guiding the guns. On top of this as well, there was a bunch of problems. The screw-type 2-ball turning mechanism was poorly designed and led to high dispersion during firing. This meant that after time, or even just after a few shots, your guns would become incredibly inaccurate, and this obviously is a bit of a problem. There was actually Captain P.F. Solomonov who actually came up with a list of over 10 defects that needed to be corrected. Once again, the problem was, though, the tank awaited trials in Moscow on January the 5th, so none of these defects were actually fixed by the time it went to the test trial stage. Now, when it went to the test trial stage in Moscow, it was inspected by a commission from the GABTU, the GAU, and also the NKV, as well as Voroshilov and Kotin, and when it was shooting from a standstill, the gunner was able to actually manage to fire all 3 guns at once on the 3rd attempt, but the precision at 400 meters ended up being absolutely abysmal. So this meant that the accuracy of the guns were really bad, and due to the factors that we talked about before, but the fire rate wasn't too bad. The rate of fire was 20 to 24 rounds per minute, and individually the guns fired pretty quickly and nearly as comparable to regular tanks that were around at the time, and therefore the only problem with that, though, is this idea of volley fire was kind of out the window because of that. The F-34, it could fire 3 rounds in 34 seconds. The 45mm 150mm guns could fire 5 times in 34 seconds. So you can see how the volley fire would actually constrict something like the 45s because of the F-34 existing. Even though the rate of fire, in my opinion, was pretty good, it was deemed unsatisfactory by the Commission. And then on top of this as well, the unsatisfactory accuracy of the guns, especially when firing in a volley. And then the thickness of the front armor was also deemed insufficient, so they wanted to increase it to 110 to 120 millimeters. And then on top of this as well, they wanted it to have two 76mm guns instead of the two 45s and the one F-34 76mm. So with all of these being changed, there was just a bunch of, after receiving the results of the trials, Stalin also wrote a decree saying on the production of the KV-7 and KV-8 tanks, cancel the proposed 3-gun KV-7 tank, and it was not, cancelled in its entirety, but the general idea was to add 2 ZIS-5 guns to it instead. So with the first variant of the KV-7, the work on the dual ZIS-5 guns were assigned, and therefore, they wanted to completely build the thing, and it wasn't built from scratch. They pretty much just used the first prototype, the old KV-7, and added the 2 guns to it. Only the gun mantlet and the ammunition racks were changed to it, and then there were new trials on the KV-7 once again, which were planned March 7th, 1942. They wanted to do 400 shots at a 50-kilometer drive, and in reality, everything went a little bit differently. So the priority of the KV-7 was reduced by this point, so the tank only began trials on the 14th of May instead of the 7th of March. It was only able to get a rate of fire of 6 to 7 rounds per minute, and the system itself was unbalanced. This meant that the sights would shift after each shot, so once again accuracy being a big problem with this machine. The ammunition rack as well was deemed inconvenient, and the turning mechanism had to be operated by both hands, so therefore lining up the targets and also loading and also aiming was going to become incredibly cumbersome, and because of all of these problems, the interest in the KV-7 waned after the trials were finished. It came back in October 1942, when Solomonov once again inspected a bunch of experimental SPGs at the Kirov factory where the KV-7 was first introduced, and he actually came up with some ideas. Add a commander's cupola to it, some of the systems should be tuned, and also it should be sent to military trials once again. But this never came to fruition. The idea was completely binned, and the KV-7 didn't really do anything. The only thing it really did was it helped create a specific transmission which was used for some of the later prototypes of the KV series of vehicle. There is also an interesting story as well when it comes to proposals. They wanted to take the KV-7 and put a 152mm on it, so basically just make it a big donk gun, very similar to the Su-152. But once again, that idea never came through. This specific proposal that I'm talking about, I would like to see the KV-7 with the 245s and the 76 with reduced armor. I think that fit pretty good in the game, especially with the history around it. The French should also get some love in this. So the vehicle that I've chosen for the French is known as the ELC 90, which is a prototype of the ELC AMX series of vehicles, which never actually got to full production, but are really cool, and hopefully we see at least some of them in the game at some point. If you don't know about the ELC project in France, pretty much what we have in 1955 was the French Ministry of Defense launched an idea of creating some prototypes around the idea of being incredibly lightly armored and also having a lot of firepower. We see this in other vehicles such as like the AML 90, which is in game, but with the ELCs they were also supposed to be tracked and be around about 6 tons, at the same time be able to be airlifted into deployment zones. The reason for this is so the infantry could have some form of anti-tank presence or anti-tank cover for themselves, and it could be maneuvered a hell of a lot easier than some of the larger machines that we see from other nations or even France themselves. So instead of getting, instead of having a large cumbersome vehicle, you would create a small small vehicle which had a two-man crew, and it was going to be operated by just two people, a driver, and then an individual in the turret, which would be the gunner, the loader, and the commander all at the same time, and would only have access, to everything in the turret, and everything would move smoothly through there. So yeah, it's a really cool little combat thing. They didn't actually hit the 6-ton requirement; they went a little bit over it. The ELC 90 is a little bit closer to 7 tons than it is actually to the 6-ton idea. But for me, I think in War Thunder, as a person who really enjoys a lot of scout vehicles, and also has been enjoying a lot stuff like the AMX-13s and also the AML-90, it would be nice to see one of these ELCs in game. Now, I've picked the 90 just because of the fact that it has, the 90mm Makar gun. It's an incredibly good gun, and it should be able to pretty much annihilate anything that it finds, along with, its other ideas, such as it had 36 shells on board, which is kind of insane when you think about it. But on top of this as well, there were some other versions of the ELC, the AMX series. The first one was the one which had a twin 30mm setup of Hispano-Suiza autocannons with fluted barrels in the turret. You also had the ELC Even 120, as it's known, which had 4 recoilless rifles in it, which would have been hilarious. You also had other variants of the ELC Even 90, which had a slightly different turret to it, and also a version which had SS11s, 4 SS11s or 2 SS12s attached to it. So you could pick any of these to put into the game. I think all of them would fit pretty well, and just having even one of these vehicles out of the 4 or 5 that you could have, I think could be wonderful as squadron vehicles. One of the most interesting periods of time for American tank development is actually not during World War II, but after World War II. And the reason for this is because the general design philosophy completely changed after World War II compared to the vehicles that were created before. At the end of World War II as well, all tank production in the US was terminated, showing that they wanted to turn over a new leaf, create some new vehicles, and push on from there. The only exceptions to this rule were actually a few experimental vehicles, which were already, being made, or at least in the design and production process. The production of the light tank, the Chaffee as well, or the M20 War, had ended in August 1945, and one of the things that it was seen of it, even though it was used until and even after the Korean War, it fell down in a few areas. The fact that it only had a 75mm, the fact that it wasn't as fast as certain other machines around the time. So therefore, there was a review done and a proposal to push forward a new light tank design. It was going to be about 25 tons in weight. It would have increased firepower and mobility compared to the light tank M24, the Chaffee, and also it would have a gun approximately 3 inches in caliber, capable of penetrating 5 inches of homogeneous steel armor at 30 degrees and at a range of 1,000 yards. That was the general ideas behind it, and then everything else was a little bit, up in the air. So by early 1949, they'd completed a design for a vehicle which they were happy with. The T-37 was complete, a wooden mock-up was constructed of it, and then the drawings were released for production to create 2 pilot tanks. It was a new vehicle with the new ideas of this light tank pushed into it. It had a main crew of 4, the commander, gunner, loader, and also the driver, of course, in the hull. There was other stuff which was kind of interesting about it too. It was powered by the AOS 8951 gasoline engine, which was manufactured by Continental Motors as part of a new family of engines for military vehicles. So this was kind of, once again, a brave step into the future. And on top of this as well, because of that, they needed to not just get the drivetrain correct, they didn't just have to get the transmission correct, and also the engine and the power and everything. One of the main things that they needed to get correct was the gun and also what they would use on it. So they actually went through 3 phases when it came to the turret design and what they wanted to add to it. So they knew they wanted something around a 76mm. The first gun that they picked was the T94. This was the Phase 1 design idea, and it was in the T137 combination gun mount. The weapon had a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second with armor-piercing ammunition, and the primary aiming device for the cannon was the stereoscopic optical rangefinder. By the time they got to Phase 2 of the turret, it was armed with a higher velocity 76mm gun, the T91, and was also equipped with a new fire control system. This fire control system had the azimuth and elevation stabilization in it, meaning that this gun was a 76mm that was stabilized, which is something that we don't see from the Bulldog. The Phase 3 turret then once again incorporated either the T91 gun with an automatic loader or a stubby case 76mm gun, which was proposed. The Phase 3 vehicle eventually was to completely integrate with an IBM stabilization system and also power loading. This fire control system was to include a stereoscopic rangefinder as well, an automatic lead computer, and an automatic ballistic corrector. So you can see there's a lot of high-tech stuff going into this, even though it's still in 1949. The first pilot light tank, the T-37, was shipped to Aberdeen Proving Grounds for tests on the 30th of May 1949, and the test program continued until August 1950, when the T-37 was returned to Detroit Arsenal for a production study after the outbreak of the war in Korea. Now, the story doesn't end there, and you may wonder, where are we going to? Well, we're actually talking about the beginning stages of what eventually wound up as the M41 Bulldog, and from the T-37 came the T-41. The T-41 was a more refined version of the T-37, with 3 T-41s being completed and evaluated at Aberdeen and Fort Knox along with the T-37. It was armed with the high-velocity 76mm gun, the T-91, and also it was very similar to the T-37 when it came to its turret, apart from the fact that the flat roof was reinforced by 2 external stiffeners installed at an angle of 60 degrees. A later version of the T-41 turret as well had a roof which peaked at the center and sloped towards each side, eliminating the need for the stiffeners. The Vickers fire control system was also involved in this, so the gun was stabilized, and also when it came to its elevation, I should say, and it also included a dual color coincidence type rangefinder and an automatic lead computer, and the track tension idler was eliminated on the suspension of the T-41 pilot tank. So we're slowly but surely getting to the M41, the Bulldog, which we all well and know. And the test program indicated that the rangefinder was a definite advantage. It basically meant that you had a pretty good accuracy rate at long-range firing, which is something that was incredibly, needed, especially as the engagement lengths were increasing. The Vickers fire control system, though, still required a lot of development to it and to actually be ready for production. So that was a little bit of a downside when it came to the testing grounds, and the requirement for the stabilization system was actually dropped, but the rangefinder itself was retained. So by this point in the development, this is where the Bulldog, which the T-41 eventually becomes, loses its stabilization. So if you want a stabilized vehicle, you would have to either have an early version of a T-41 or a T-37 to be in the game. The other thing as well is there was another thing that was taken out. The dual color coincidence type rangefinder on the T-41 worked in tandem with the fire control system, and since they just removed that, then they'd have to remove that as well. So therefore a modified version of the stereoscopic rangefinder from the light tank T-37 was used on the T-41. There was a bunch of problems when it came to the T-41 in testing and when it came to its reliability, especially of its powertrain. So those had to be fixed, and one of the interesting things is during Korea, the Americans were working on, of course, the T-41E1, but they weren't too bothered about sending this to Korea. They didn't think that this new light tank that they were building would actually be used in Korea, since obviously, you know, the forces were still there. They actually thought the main fight around the 1950s would be in Europe once again, with the Soviet menace increasing in the east. The Americans believed that they would have to create vehicles which would once again fight in the European theatre. So therefore, they created these vehicles with the idea that that was going to happen. The problem with this, though, is something because of the fear of the Soviets, you know, moving over into Western Europe was very much apparent for the Americans. They rushed through the testing and of these vehicles, and they pushed through the ideas to create the T-41E1 and then the Bulldog. And even though there was a bunch of stuff wrong with the machines, they were seeing that if they were able to get them through into that state of being built, they could retrofit them and fix all of the issues that they thought of. This worked incredibly well during World War II for the Americans, even though it did cause a lot of pain to a lot of people. What it meant was they were able to get the tanks on the battlefield and then fix them later on. But since the war never happened in the 1950s with the Soviet Union, what actually happened is that this just made the whole process even more painful with the Bulldog, meaning that it was just one of those things that they had to keep refitting to keep up to modernized standards, because of the fact that they dropped the stabilizer, because of the fact that they dropped the rangefinder to get it produced, to get it out into, you know, service, to try and deal with the oncoming effect, which would be the Soviets. So yeah, that is the T-41 and also the T-37. Either of these vehicles would be lovely to see in the game. Arguably slightly better vehicles than the Bulldog would be in game, just because of the fact that they had access, you know, to those stabilization systems, depending on which ones you wanted to fit. And also, that is the end of this video. I hope you've enjoyed looking at the ground vehicles that I would love to see as Squadron vehicles, and overall, hopefully we see some more Squadron vehicles soon, since it is a really cool system that I personally really enjoy. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Ambrosius McClellan, B. Young, Blackie, Chris Giltnane, Daniel Stanton, Jay Wilt, John Ryman, Martinez, Moxie, Super Cacti, Trigger Hippie, Eugens Terry, and also Elove Goat and Samuel Slick for supporting the channel.